Legalese and jargon, a modern phenomenon? Question mark. The first question is, what is language? Now, those of you who are obviously A-level English students will have a completely different definition and concept of language to that I have. When I did A-level English, I shan't tell you how many years ago that was, it was Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton and the Romantic poets. Language as such was not anything we touched, and we gave that up at O-level, you know. So I'm sure everyone has their own definition of what language is. But I think that one of the most obvious is it must be a tool for communicating your thoughts, what you want to say, to other people. To people who may know little or nothing about the subject that you are trying to get across. So the language you use has got to make your meaning clear. Too many writers, I think, and this applies to professional people and to people who write the textbooks, they use a language as a way of demonstrating their own knowledge. They forget that to people who don't have their background and their knowledge, it's no use using this jargon. No one is going to actually understand them. To get your ideas across, you've got to use the language that, in the words of the old saying, the man on the back of an omnibus is going to understand. On the other hand, to use that absolutely ghastly phrase, this is not to suggest that everything should be dumbed down to the lowest possible level. If you're writing an article for primary school teachers, I hope you don't use the language that you would use if you're talking to primary school children. Although it has to be said, some of the primary school teachers I've come across, I do wonder. However, but it's common sense, surely, if you're trying to communicate ideas, you've got to do it in a language the majority is going to understand. Now, lawyers, I hate to say, have never thought like this. Their idea is that only they, people in their profession, should understand what they're saying. I think it's a way of trying to bamboozle the public so they can't understand why they're being charged as much as they are being charged, what the lawyer's doing for them. Now, the first document we've got is a wonderful example of legalese, and I have to thank Marcus for this because he found it for me. Legal jargon, written by experts for other experts. Completely incomprehensible to the majority of us, I should say. The initials QB, I would assume to mean Queen's Bench. The only reason I know this is because my partner was just retired as clerk to a High Court judge for the last 30 years. And the words in italics refer to particular cases. But I had to read this about 3 times, and I decided that it was probably talking about who has the right to fish where. Now, could it not, do you think, have been worded slightly more, in a more simple form, and we would always know that without spending hours on it? You may think this type of legal jargon is quite a recent phenomenon, but the legal profession has for centuries never used one word where 10 will do. Any document you'll find in the record office or elsewhere, such as a deed or a will, that can be called upon to prove a particular transaction or event, and that's basically all that deeds and wills are. They are wonderful examples of this. All a deed needs to tell you is the date the transaction takes place, who the parties are, i.e. the person on the side doing something and the person on that side who's, if you like, it's being done to, the money being paid, and what type of transaction it is. Is it a lease of property? Is it an outright sale? Is it a mortgage? And a description of what this property is. A fairly simple concept. In the medieval period, it was. Any deed that you look at of the 12th and 13th century is probably going to be no larger than what? About 20 by 12 centimetres, and some are smaller. They could get it all into 2 or 3 lines. The more you come up to date, the longer winded and the larger the documents become. Now, number 2, which looks like that. If you like, you should wear 2 on the top anyway. A nice, simple grant relating to some land in the parish of Barhampton near Bath. It is, of course, in Norman French, but that's obviously that's what they used in that period. So you know, that's not what I'm talking about. It's not legalese, it's just the language that was in use. Now, the one complicated part of this, to modern minds, is the way they've actually written the date. It translates as the Friday next, after the Feast of the Trinity, in the year of the reign of King Edward III after the Conquest, 19. So you need all that to give you the date. You'll find that sort of on the last couple of lines. We would say the 27th of May, 1345. Now, the clerk who wrote it could have written it like that. They had this concept of using, the day and the month and the year. But he's determined that there's going to be no room for misunderstanding. So he specifies that the king is the third Edward after the Norman Conquest in 1066. This is just to make sure you don't think it's Edward the Confessor or Edward the First or Edward the Second. And he uses the ecclesiastical calendar. Every cleric or clerk, and let's remember at this date it's only the clerics who are actually going to be able to read and to write these documents. Every cleric knows that the 19th year of King Edward III is 1345. The date of the Feast of the Holy Trinity in that year falls on Sunday, the 22nd of May. So Friday afterwards becomes the 27th of May, and that's how they worked it out. It does sound complicated to us, but on the other hand, apart from that, the rest of it is just a very straightforward transaction between two parties and a description of the land, and that's all they needed. If you look at document 3, this is a mid-16th century will. Now, in 1345, it takes a line and a half to write the date. By 1555, it takes 6 lines. It begins in the year of our Lord God, 1555. Fine, you would say to yourself, is this not all we need? However, again, just to make absolutely sure, we all know what we're talking about, it continues in the first and second year of the reign of Philip and Mary. Well, all right, that's not too bad. We can live with that. But we have to be told exactly who Philip and Mary are. Okay, we know they're King and Queen of England, but no, they are, by the grace of God, of England, France, Naples, Jerusalem and Ireland, defenders of the faith, princes of Spain and Sicily, archdukes of Austria, dukes of Milan, Burgundy, Brabant, counts of Habsburg, Flanders and Tyrol. And in 1555 they're pushing it a bit to call themselves King and Queen of France, and as for Jerusalem, well, I'm not quite sure why that was still there. So we go on and we get to the 18th century. Document number 4, and you will notice that this deed is somewhat larger than the 1345 one. A deed for £7,500.
This one.
That's it, the A3 size one. 18th century. Yeah, 1730, I think.
Maybe they just, had bigger pens.
So we have here the 14th day of May, in the 3rd year of the reign of our sovereign Lord George II, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc. So we've still got King of France, but the etc. rolls up everything else, so we don't have to repeat everything we've had earlier. It's catch-all, just to cover everything. And instead of just saying 1730, we also have to have the Latin for in the year of the Lord, Anno Domini Quae, which is something you will get right up into the 19th century, to be absolutely certain. As I say, notice the difference in size between this one and that early medieval one. Everything has to be stated in detail, so that no lawyer can come back afterwards and find any fault with it, just in case there's some legal dispute. So when it mentions the money paid by the buyer, it's phrased as the sum of 5 shillings lawful money of Great Britain. This is just in case you thought we were using French francs or German marks. and for divers other causes and considerations, them thereunto moving. In other words, for any other reason they might have had to make this land transaction. A catch-all phrase, as I say. You can't give the size of the land exactly, just in case it later turns out to be wrong, in case they've missed an odd football here and there. So it's described as 2 closes of pasture land, containing by estimation 2 acres, be the same more or less. And again, just to make sure we've covered everything, all ways, paths, passages, waters, watercourses, hedges, trees, easements and profits, commodities, hereditaments, and appurtenances, whatsoever to the said closes of pasture land and acre of meadow, or any part thereof belonging to, or in any wise obtaining. Alright?
That makes it
So
perfect.
it comes absolutely, you can't come along after and say, oh, you never mentioned the fact there was a footpath across the middle of this field, because you've got your ways and your easements, etc., etc. Now, by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, it's even better. You get what are called multi-membrane deeds. Now, you haven't got a copy of that because I can't get on the photocopy. You are looking at something approximately that sort of size, and the multi-membrane means it's not just one sheet of parchment, it can be 5 or 6 or 7, all sewn together at the bottom. Each one takes about 8 sheets of A3 photocopies, each membrane. So you have to imagine 40 odd sheets of A3 paper spread all around the floor, all covered in writing, okay? Repetition after repetition after repetition. Basically, we think they were paid by the line. So, the more you could put in, the more money you got for it. Now, my colleague here, Esther, thinks deeds are the most boring thing it's possible to find in a record office. I personally don't. I quite like deeds, but there we are. But I have to admit that rather more interesting than that are the records you get relating to criminal cases. In particular, statements made by the witnesses to a particular case. Here you get the words that were actually said by ordinary people. They might be tidied up slightly by the clerk who was writing the evidence down, but you can hear the voice of the person coming through. So number 5, this is a very nice example of a bastard examination. The court is trying to discover the father of an unborn child. It's a bit like the sort of, what they call it these days, not the Criminal Records Bureau, the child support agency. Find a father and you find someone to support the child, otherwise it goes on the parish rates. Joan Ball is the mother, or mother-to-be, also described as the examinant. In other words, the person who is being examined, and this is the word they will always use. This examinant saith that one Stephen Dole of the parish of Brookham is the reputed father of the base child which she now goeth withal. In other words, that she's pregnant with. She goeth withal.
I am using that next, so yes.
And says that he had to do with her, in other words, they had intercourse, the Thursday before St. James last passed, in a close of the said Doles called Tillis, upon a mow saddle. What on earth? Exactly, I thought this. I thought, gosh, a bit like a Kama Sutra. I mean, a mow saddle is basically a mushroom-shaped thing which you used to put your sort of barn on to stop the rats getting up into the grain. It was actually uncomfortable. But there we are. And she says that he had to do with her, but at that one time. I mean, she was unlucky. But mind you, all these girls say that when they're being examined. They don't want to give the court the impression they were, having to weigh with all the sundry.
It could have been him.
So it's very plain, it's very direct, it tells you all you need to know. If you move on to document 6,
Oh, God.
this comes from Bridgewater. It's a coroner's inquest into the death of a newborn baby. So this is the coroner writing, it's not the evidence of the mother of the child. So he says, on or about the 14th day of January last, Mary Higgins, late of Bridgewater, aforesaid, single woman, was privately and by herself alone delivered of a living female bastard child. The said Mary Higgins, not having the fear of God before her eyes, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, Then and there, feloniously, and of her malice aforethought, did kill and murder, and the said bastard child sometime thereafter did, privately put and lay in a ditch of water, about 3 foot deep, situate and being on the north side of a certain street, called Eastover in Bridgewater, against the peace of our said Lord the King, his crown and dignity. She might have admitted she'd killed her baby, but I bet she didn't say it like that. That's the coroner making sure he's got everything covered. And this is 1747, and it seems to me quite late still to be talking about the instigation of the devil, but it's obviously a phrase that they use for cases like this, because they obviously postnatal depression, etc., was not a recognised excuse. 7 and 8. What you've got here is part of a broadsheet account of the trial of 2 men at Taunton in 1832, and an extract from a pamphlet which was written after their executions. The pamphlet is very interesting actually because, unlike as one would expect at that period, it actually argues against the death penalty. Not in all cases, but in this particular case when they say the judge got it wrong. They were actually condemned for having assaulted a girl called Hannah Richards and for having stolen 9 shillings and 5 pence, which is the equivalent of about 45p in modern terms, from her. But it's the theft, not the assault, that's the capital crime. They're hung for the theft, they're not hung for the assault. Okay. Now, I'm not going to read anything from the actual broadsheet, so you can keep these copies if you want to read yourselves later. But the authors of the pamphlet say, to estimate accurately the nature and degree of this outrage, it would be unfair to leave out of consideration the habits and character of the prosecutrix, that's Hannah, which might prove to be of a description to render her little susceptible of the shame which usually attaches to insight and exposure. This circumstance must, we apprehend, operate very much to extenuate the mischief and injury inflicted upon her person and her feelings. This girl was a local prostitute in Shepton Mallet. What they're saying is that because she's that, because she comes from the lower social class, the assault on her was not so serious as it would have been from a girl of a higher social class. Her feelings are such, she's so brutalised, she's not going to be offended by the fact these chaps pulled her skirt up round her ears and threw her over the church wall and dragged her through a pond. You know, it doesn't matter so much because she's not of this higher social status. Mind? Now, the authors go on in this pamphlet to discuss the state of the country as a whole. And we've got 2 wonderful sentences here that actually take 14 lines to say things that, things aren't as bad as people think they are. Okay? Now, I have to take a deep breath for this one because it does go on. And here we cannot refrain from observing that opinions upon the state of the country as to insubordination and depravity are not infrequently fallacious and questionable. It is by no means, for example, manifest or generally assented to by those whose opportunities enable them to form an opinion upon the subject, that atrocious offences affecting life and property are at present on the increase. Ferocity, drunkenness, gross personal violence of all kinds are, we presume to suggest, visibly diminished throughout the country. A degree of mental improvement is apparent. The manners of the people are softened and humanised. Education and civility have made some slight progress even in these agricultural regions. And the increased repugnance to sanguinary punishments which pervades all classes, and which we see manifested in favour of convicts under sentence of death, we consider, perhaps erroneously, to be an indication of general civilisation and improvement.
You deserve a tap for that.
Yes. Yes. I do think one needs
breathing lessons.
Sit down and think about that for a while. Really, as I say, apart from thinking that Victorians must have much greater lung capacity than we had, you're going to get that last sentence out. But that last quote, I think, really sums up what I was trying to say at the beginning about using language that can be understood by everyone. That it was never going to change the views of people with a basic level of education in Victorian times. There was no way they could have actually followed the argument. If you just attended the equivalent of primary school up until about the age of 10, you were not going to actually understand what that fact was saying. Its authors were trying to gain support for a change in the law related to the death penalty. They were addressing the people with the political will and the vote, political power, to get those laws changed. So, obviously, they used language they thought would be understood by people with that condition. If they had written it for common people, who's to say we wouldn't have had the abolition of the death penalty much sooner if people had actually started, to think about it earlier. But that really is it. I hope, and it's been very brief, obviously, I've only been able to pick a few examples of the types of document the Record Office holds. But for those of you studying language, you can see, I think, the development there of the fact that more is better, and the more complicated it sounds, the better it is. And for the one lawyer amongst you, again, some idea of the legal changes in legal format or legal wording in documents to make sure that no one is ever going to be able to come down and say you got that wrong, if this document isn't valid because you didn't put in this, this, and this. If anyone's got any questions?
It's just
Done.
I'm just guessing that
Yeah.
legal language has become more and more complicated as people become more and more educated. Because you know how you said how lawyers were trying to distance themselves so that only they can understand it. It keeps their profession going. But also, when there was the really short ones in 1, 2, and stuff, people couldn't understand it apart from the people that were meant to.
Only the people who could read and write, and that, of course, is a very small minority of the population. As I think you're quite right, as more people become educated, lawyers make it yet more complicated. They're trying to keep one step ahead. Would you agree with this, Marcus?
Until we get that complete turnaround, when the sort of the crystal clear campaign sort of kicks in, but then that really hasn't taken off.
Not I think as far as lawyers are concerned. I mean, I think a lot of perhaps the big companies now try and make their paperwork much simpler to understand.
And I know there's some campaigns for
plain English.
Yeah.
You get, don't you? Now?
Yeah, isn't there the plain English campaign? Yeah.
Do you get a feeling that there has always been a...
Or for better education.
Absolutely.
I'm still not sure how well educated you are.
Yes.
But that last sort of sentence, it would be so. It could be written so much more simply. Couldn't it? You wouldn't use sanguinary punishment or something with the death penalty. Why not say so?
Yeah, because some of the Lexus is just...
Obviously, there's a heavy skew to the data that you get at the Records Office because it's survived through the legal process, it's been protected
That's
by
right.
the courts, so there's a kind of bias there. But do you get a feeling that there has always been a strong litigious kind of
people, yes.
thrust to the society?
Yeah. If you in the 18th century, if you look at some of the correspondence of the landed families, a heck of a lot of their time was spent arguing with their neighbours about who owned what and whether they had the right to take water out of the mill stream or whether they were just not maintaining this road. So even in personal correspondence or business correspondence, again, you have these legal phrases and words.
What was it that was a death knell to the very elaborate royal acknowledgement? Do you think there was one particular, or did it just gradually fade out?
It gradually faded out. It became obvious that it's no good calling yourself King of Jerusalem by the time you get to the 17th century. And we gave up on, I mean, quite late. I don't know when we gave up calling ourselves Kings of France or Queens of France. In the 19th century?
Really?
How can I see it?
Certainly, well, it's
Oh, you look beautiful.
You did go into the 19th, but not quite sure, to be honest. I quite like it. Because as you know, once you've got a lawyer's format, it's set in stone and doesn't change.
And of course the people who are currently using it are probably reluctant to relinquish it, and therefore the new people who come in order to get a job, they need to be able to do the same, and it just keeps on going in the cycle.
Yes. It's like going for a job interview. If you can speak the jargon, then you're well ahead, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But if you look at the blurb at the beginning of any action department, it still has that kind of formulaic structure to it, doesn't it? If you've read the statutory stuff.
Because it's traditional.
The hounds are baying at the doors. I think lower six are keen to get in. Thank you. Round of applause. Thank you so much.
I said, leave the copies if any of you want to look through them and
language student.
Thank you, Lewis. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, that's superb. Everyone's got a program. Do you have a program for the thing to do? Super. Take a handful of it. Not that we're trying to converge at all.
Spread the word. Be excited.
Oh, you're joking. Yes, we're going to have one bath group, which is up for all those who didn't make it previously.
We were the only circumcision.
Thanks, Lewis. That's great for you doing that.